The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government, and we will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs and our IGs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. Today, I first want to thank our ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for joining me in this hearing that will serve as a fact-based blueprint for a conversation unfolding about government savings and government spending. With attention to policymakers on how best to manage an $85 billion sequestration, this is the time to lead the discussion on finding and eliminating waste that is based in fact. We have heard tales of massive teacher layoffs, pay cuts, Capitol janitors, security guards, and many other effects of sequestration. I am here to say some of them might be true. There will be, in fact, reductions in the size of the Federal workforce. There will be changes in contracts. But many of them can be avoided if we look for win-win savings. One of our challenges is knowing whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, whether you are in the House or the Senate, whether you are an IG or administering a part of government. We all know that there are embedded waste in government. There are fiefdoms, if you will, that over the years with their budget divisions have built up inherent duplicative programs. We have spent years examining them. We are today meeting, among others, with two widely respected IGs who, among other things, by definition will tell us it is frustrating to be an IG. You don't control your budget. You may not even control whether or not there is an IG in the post, or, as often happens under both administrations that I have served under, you have acting positions. There are widely different rules on what an IG can do, but most importantly, IGs under the current law have a number of limitations. If someone leaves the Federal workforce, they leave the ability of an IG to specifically demand their presence and hold them accountable. If someone is in another part of government not covered by that particular IG, it is only on the request and granting by the other agency that an investigation can cross the lines of jurisdiction. It is inherently wrong. We form joint task forces. We spend each other's money. We work together. We are one government. And we need to have solutions that meet that one government oversight. More importantly, with sequestration, one thing we are considering here today is IGs are not immune from it. In any company I can imagine, in tough times, when you are making budget cuts and you are looking to find waste, you don't lay off the people who find the waste for you. You don't, in a fraud situation, get rid of your auditors. That is one of the challenges we will face. And as a committee and the primary committee of jurisdiction for all IGs, one of our challenges is to empower a small $2 billion total government budget and about 12,000 men and women that call themselves IGs to do more, not less. We also today have entered for the record, and it is on our website, one of the continuing reports that began with several of my predecessors ago, in which we look at the potential savings. I want to make it clear, the number in that figure continues to rise. It rises for two reasons. Government is getting bigger, and the reporting we are getting is more detailed. And I want to thank all those who annually give us that information for scrubbing better and better. As far as I can tell, we have never had a year in which we got less. We always got more. One of my predecessors, Mr. Henry Waxman, under the Bush administration, put out a number of $26 billion that could be saved if the Bush administration would act faster on these suggestions. At the time, I was probably what you'd call an apologist. I was looking for how many of those were relatively recent, how many had been closed, how inherently fair or unfair Mr. Waxman's work was. When the burden changed from Mr. Waxman to myself, I began to realize that he had done the Bush administration a great favor. The numbers, in fact, were simply tabulations of what was reported. Some, in fact, could be explained. Many could be explained. Some would be dealt with in a short period of time, and many were. But, as we all know, Mr. Cummings, myself, and everyone on the dais, oversight is, in fact, about recognizing the potential for savings, recognizing and putting in front of the administration at a minimum and the public in some cases what we can do, and then encouraging it to happen faster. This committee has had some recent successes in finding specific areas of waste and overpayment, pushing the government to act faster to save the taxpayers literally billions of dollars. It's the kind of thing we should do and we will do. I'm halfway through my chairmanship. Being halfway through a chairmanship tells you that when you look behind you, you ask, have I done enough? And the answer is, I haven't. Looking forward, I have little time to do more. So with my partners on both sides of the dais, today we're starting a much greater dialogue with our IGs, a much greater dialogue with the changes that need to be made if, in fact, government outside of this body, in the executive branch, can do better, do quicker to save the taxpayers' money. And with that, I'd like to thank my partner, Mr. Cummings, for his help in preparation of this hearing, and I recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I appreciate your statements. And as you were talking, I could not help but be reminded that in so many instances, our IGs are our last line of defense. Last line of defense. IGs are critical to ensuring that our government works effectively and efficiently on behalf of American taxpayers. They'll be meeting a deadline on April 15th, that is the taxpayers, and they want to know that their money is spent effectively and efficiently. And you're right, Mr. Chairman, we need to be acting with the urgency of now if we are going to make a difference. Our committee in particular relies heavily on the IG's detailed audits, inspections, and investigations to support our oversight efforts. We depend on IGs to cast a very critical eye over all aspects of agency operations, to question why things are done the way they are done, and to affirmatively identify ways to improve program effectiveness. We are indeed partners with the IG because they, in so many instances, provide us with information that we are then able to look into and make changes. In December, Chairman Issa and I sent joint letters to all 73 IGs asking them to identify their most significant open recommendations for reducing waste and improving efficiency in their agencies. Today's hearing will be the first of a series of hearings to examine these recommendations. Today, I'm happy to welcome the IGs from the Departments of Education and Transportation, as well as the Deputy Secretaries from each department. I would like to give special welcome to my friend, Deputy Secretary John Pecori. He served for many years as Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation, and I have had the opportunity to work closely with him on important transportation issues for my State. I have the deepest respect. I look forward to hearing from him and our other witnesses about how they are working to improve our government. In addition, I plan to ask all of our witnesses about the devastating effects of sequestration. Mr. Chairman, just this weekend, I was at an IHOP restaurant after church, and a lady walked in with her 11-year-old, and she mentioned to me that she is going to be, she just got the sequester notice from the Department of Defense that she would be missing, that she would be having to be furloughed for 4 days out of a month, and it would cost her $800. She's got 2 kids, one in college, and one 11-year-old who she had with her, and she literally broke out in tears. And the reason why I say this, is that I mention this, is that I want us to be reminded that sequestration does have an impact, but we can hopefully lessen that impact by making sure that we spend dollars effectively and efficiently, in the long run, to make sure that those dollars are spent in a way where we can avoid those kinds of situations. This is a huge issue, and frankly, we would be derelict in our duty if we did not examine how these arbitrary and massive cuts will impact core government services that Americans across the country rely on every single day. Like almost all Federal agencies, the two departments testifying before us today will have to make deep cuts to key programs and services. For example, these drastic cuts will reduce our mobility in the skies. The vast majority of FAA's 47,000 employees are facing extensive furloughs, including air traffic controllers. This will result in delays and disruptions at our airports, canceled flights, and impeded commerce. I know there are many who are saying that these sequestration will have little impact. They just need to come to my district. Sequestration also will have a devastating impact on education programs across the country, including on our most vulnerable folks, our children. Cuts in Title I grants to high-poverty school districts could eliminate support to an estimated 2,700 schools and 1.2 million disadvantaged students. Sequestration also deeply impacts children with disabilities, slashing funds and programs that provide special education teachers, staff, and other support. The irony is that we are holding a hearing today on IG recommendations to make these two agencies more effective and efficient, but it will be more difficult for these agencies to implement these recommendations while their budgets are being cut and their employees are being furloughed. You are absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. When we've got a group of people who are basically saving the taxpayers' money and making sure those monies are being spent effectively and efficiently, those are the last people we need to see being furloughed. Even IG officers themselves will feel the negative effects of sequestration, hindering their ability to conduct the very oversight work we are praising them for today. And so I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. And as to the report that the Chairman is submitting, I thank you for your courtesy in talking to me before the hearing. And I thank you for making it clear that if there is any disagreement in the numbers, we can resolve them at a future date. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman very much. We now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today. I couldn't agree with you more. This hearing is about facts. This hearing is about credibility. And let's just cut to the chase. If government agencies and the secretaries who head those agencies would spend more time implementing the IG's recommendation and less time scaring the American people with all the political statements they've made regarding sequestration, the taxpayers would be a lot better off. It's just simple facts. We had a hearing 2 weeks ago, last week, where we had the Special Inspector General for TARP come in and talk about repeatedly, 3 years now, she has made recommendations to the paymaster, the Special Master for Executive Compensation, and only one of the 8 recommendations she's repeatedly made have been implemented. And the facts are this: in 2009, when that program was put in place, when the taxpayers bailed out 7 different companies, only 6 executives were getting pay of over $500,000 a year. Now, with only 2 companies still left in the program, 23 executives are getting pay of over $500,000 a year because the paymaster won't follow the Inspector General's recommendations. This is something that has to be done if we're going to save the taxpayers the kind of money they deserve to have saved. And of course, just this past week, Mr. Chairman, when President Obama said at his press conference that the janitors and security guards who work at the Capitol will face pay cuts, the superintendent of the Capitol had to send an email out to employees saying pay and benefits will not be impacted. Once again, the President was making statements that just weren't accurate. Of course, the one that's most famous is the Secretary of Education, Mr. Duncan. And you don't have to take my word for that he misled the American people. Take the Washington Post, that conservative newspaper who always takes the conservative position. Take their word for it. When Mr. Duncan said this, it means a lot more children will not get the kinds of service and opportunities they need, and as many as 40,000 teachers could lose their job. Here's what the Washington Post said. The Washington Post said, and I'll quote, Mr. Duncan made this claim not once, not twice, but 3 times. Let this be a teachable moment for him. Next time before going on television, check your facts. And then the last line in the article says, 4 Pinocchios. That's the most you can get. That means he totally misled the American people on this. We need more time spent on implementing what the Inspector Generals tell our agencies to do, less time spent on this political game of scaring the American people about 2.4% cut to the overall federal budget. So I appreciate the Chairman bringing this hearing, having the witness today. I look forward to a good hearing for all members, and would yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
And I thank my colleague for yielding. And Mr. Chairman,
for 2 minutes and 16 seconds.
Yes, and yes, I'll keep it brief.
The gentleman is only yielding his time.
Thanks. Well, actually, you could just give me 2.4% less in light of this sequester. So with that, I just wanted to say that this Congress has acted to give the executive branch dramatic flexibility for budget for implementing the sequester. Dramatic flexibility. Presidents, for my full lifetime, have asked for this level of budget flexibility. This President has said he does not want it. And so the implementation of the sequester has been limited in terms of how agencies can fulfill those cuts, but the executive branch does have flexibility in implementing this to make sure that person that the ranking member met on Sunday after church doesn't have to be in tears and does not have to be furloughed. There are many choices the executive branch could make, beginning with the recommendations from the IGs. And so I thank my colleague for yielding and would yield back the balance.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yield back by time.
I thank both the gentlemen.
Good.
We now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, for the opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings. The implementation of recommendations from our Inspectors General can serve to decrease waste and ensure that the Federal Government is spending the taxpayers' money as efficiently as possible. I want to welcome our witnesses here today and tell you I look forward to hearing about the work of the IGs today and working with my colleagues to maximize the efficiency of government, an endeavor which is increasingly important during these difficult economic times. For example, bridge safety is particularly important in my district. I represent the 17th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, including Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania. In Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania alone, we have 66 bridges that have been graded as structurally deficient or have deterioration to one or more of their major components, and another 4 bridges that are closed entirely. That's more than 10% of the total bridge closures in the state of Pennsylvania. It represents more than an inconvenience. It's a danger and a looming expense that will be difficult to pay. It's the type of issue we need to head off before it gets to this point, and I believe the recommendations of the IG can help. Unfortunately, implementation of these recommendations is going to be all the more difficult because the testimony from the Inspectors General Teig and Scoville come in the midst of yet another manufactured fiscal crisis. Republican leadership's refusal to negotiate in good faith with President Obama has forced our nation into this sequestration, costing vital programs the money needed to operate. The cuts to the Department of Education and Transportation each measure about $2 billion. The Department of Education will see devastating decreases in areas including special education programs, disability services, and higher education. Transportation cuts will slash the budget of the key safety agencies such as the Federal Aviation Administration. Moreover, the CR put forth by the Republican leadership this week would further slash funding to areas such as highway safety to below the levels agreed upon just last year in MAP 21, the Comprehensive Surface Transportation Bill. The CR also fails to account for the new structures put in place by MAP 21, thus allocating money to accounts that no longer exist in law while not funding new vital programs. These are real problems with relatively simple fixes that Congress should be solving instead of creating new issues for these departments. Additionally, the very IG offices that make these recommendations will be cut by the sequester. Inspector General Tighe's office will be reduced by $3 million, and Inspector General Scoville's office will lose $4 million. If we're to emphasize the role played by these offices, it makes no sense to allow this sequester to cut back on their future work. The negative impacts of sequester cuts are simply more proof that blindly hacking at the budget is not an effective path towards fiscal responsibility. If we're to make progress in reducing waste and maximizing services, we can't allow the sequester to continue. We can begin by following a common-sense approach like the ones proposed by Representative Chris Van Hollen and House Democrats, or the White House, which replaces the sequester by closing loopholes for oil and gas companies, ensuring the wealthy don't use tax breaks to pay less than their fair share, and things like refocusing our farm subsidies. We cannot do this alone. I urge Republican leadership to come to the table in order to seriously and responsibly seek a balanced approach that will put our nation on a path towards fiscal responsibility without jeopardizing our services or our national economic recovery. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. We'd now like to welcome our witnesses today. The Honorable Anthony W. Miller is Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education and is Education Department's Chief Operating Officer. The Honorable Kathleen Tai is Inspector General of the United States Department of Education. Welcome. And the Honorable John Porcari is Deputy Secretary at the U.S. Department of Transportation and is DOT's Chief Operating Officer. And the Honorable Calvin L. Scoville. Okay, I'll get it right, honest. Scoville III is the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation. And as many of you have seen on C-SPAN, pursuant to our rules, would you please rise to take the oath? And raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect, please have a seat, all witnesses answered in the affirmative. This panel is extremely important to us. Your opening statements are all in the record in their entirety. So to the greatest extent possible, if you could limit yourself to the 5 minutes, summarize where appropriate, we'd appreciate it. And that will leave more time for the Q&A that I know you're all looking forward to. And with that, Mr. Miller, if you'd lead off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and committee members for the opportunity to testify before you on the Department's efforts to improve efficiency, reduce fraud, and reduce waste. My testimony today will be organized around 4 key components. First, I'd like to start with our overarching philosophy. Since the start of our administration in 2009, Secretary Duncan and our team have been committed to enhancing how the Department conducts its operations. When the Secretary asked me to join his team, it was with an explicit intent to leverage my extensive private sector experience to enhance the Department's operational and performance management capabilities. The Department of Education is committed to a philosophy of continuous improvement as we manage a broad array of programs and activities as cost-effectively as possible that will help ensure our nation's students have the opportunity to obtain a world-class education. And I can tell you with confidence that while we remain focused on ways to continuously improve our performance, the Department of Education has long been engaged in making dramatic gains in our programmatic and operational efficiency. Let me start with what we've done to streamline our grant and federal aid programs. Recognizing that 99% of the federal funds for the Department are invested in programs, we know that programmatic change will have the highest impact. We looked at programs across the Department with an eye toward increasing efficiency, maximizing impact, and ensuring the sustainability of improvements. We proposed, and Congress enacted, reforms to the student loan programs in 2010, which saves taxpayers $68 billion by boosting our share of Federal student loan volume from around 20% to 100%. We also propose cost-cutting efforts to further save billions of dollars by eliminating and consolidating some department programs and reforming other programs. From 2010 to 2012, Congress acted on many of these recommendations by eliminating 49 programs, which resulted in savings of taxpayers of $1.2 billion a year. The next area I want to talk about is how we have adopted a risk management approach. Overall, the Department has historically been very efficient in administering its grants and loans programs, but we wanted to evaluate areas for further improvement. In particular, we worked aggressively to improve how we support and provide oversight of grantees and student aid recipients to mitigate the risk of waste, fraud, and abuse before it happens. We have added steps to prescreen all grantee slates, for example, recognizing that the more we can do early in the process reduces the potential risks later in the process. We have also taken steps post-award to mitigate the risk. We focus on working closely with our Inspector General and GAO in this effort. And in our first year, Secretary Duncan met with GAO's Controller General to ensure a collaborative working relationship. And likewise, the Secretary and I work very cooperatively with Inspector General Tai. And we put in place formal processes to ensure both GAO and IG have access to the Department staff and have access to the resources and to stay apprised of key issues. In the last 12 months, we have dramatically improved our ability to identify and resolve high-priority audits in a timely manner, and we are finding new ways to leverage audits to make targeted improvements in other critical areas. For the remaining 1% of the Department's funds, which are reflected in our administrative spending, we have taken a multi-pronged approach to improve our efforts. From an internal management perspective, we have tried to control personnel levels, which represents 1/3 of the administrative cost, as well as taking on 60% of the Department's administrative costs in the area of contracts. We have reduced rented office space. We have taken advantage of emerging technologies such as cloud computing. And specifically, we have held and/or reduced staffing levels. For example, since 2010, we have gone from more than 4,400 full-time equivalents to approximately 4,250 FTEs, resulting in approximately $18 million in annual cost savings. Lastly, let me turn our attention to Executive Order 13589, promoting efficient spending. In response to the President's executive order, we took a holistic approach at spending and aggressively cut travel, printing, and supply costs. We were able to exceed this target in fiscal year 12, reducing spending on these activities by more than 20%. Key steps we took included, wherever possible, using video conferencing and conference calls to reduce travel, publishing online instead of hard copy when we could, and getting smarter in our acquisition of supplies. These strategies have enabled us to cut spending on travel by 20%, reduce spending on printing and supplies by 30% and 29% respectively. And we are on pace to meet the 30% reduction requirement in the OMB's Memorandum 1212. In conclusion, I'd just like to say, while we're focused on the topic of efficiency, as has already been highlighted, I would be remiss if I did not address the issue of the sequester. Even as you ask us to take thoughtful surgical steps to save money, which is smart government, the sequester requires us to cut by hatchet in a way that is not good for government. At a time when we should be investing in education to ensure our nation's youth will be prepared for the increasingly globally competitive world, the steps sequestration forces us to take are counterproductive, to use a gentle word. The Department remains committed to ensuring that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and that recipients of taxpayer funds are used as intended. We are proud of the work we have accomplished thus far and look forward to continuing to improve on both our process and our outcomes. Thank you, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today about the efforts we are undertaking to improve and promote efficiency and reduce costs. I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Dye.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, I am pleased to be here today to discuss opportunities to reduce waste and improve efficiency at the U.S. Department of Education. I want to thank the committee for its work in highlighting the issue of unimplemented OIG recommendations and for shining a spotlight on a topic that is an important part of good government. Since 2007, we have reported to this committee on several occasions on recommendations made in OIG reports that the Department had not yet implemented. Our most recent letter focused on high-priority short-term and long-term recommendations. We highlighted recommendations we have made in 5 very diverse areas, all of which we believe are important to the Department's ability to deliver its programs and operations efficiently and without waste of taxpayer dollars. As is set out more fully in my written statement, those areas are Federal student aid fraud rings, the Federal student aid debt management system, IT security, improper payments, and charter schools. Each of these areas is directly aligned with the Department's management challenges for this fiscal year as identified by my office. The goal of our audit, investigative, and related work in these and other areas is not simply to identify problems, but to recommend improvements and promote corrective action. Since 2002, my office has issued 6 reports on the Department's audit resolution and follow-up processes, each noting problems with ineffective internal controls, lack of staff and training to conduct resolution activity, and a lack of organizational priority placed on audit resolution. Our most recent audit, issued in 2012, found that 90% of the external OIG audits issued in the 3-year period we looked at had not been resolved within the 6-month deadline mandated by OMB. Over half of these were overdue for resolution by an average of over 1,000 days and included question costs of $568 million. Because the Department did not act, it lost the opportunity to recover $415 million of these question costs as a result of the statute of limitations. The results of our work, whether it's audits, inspections, or investigations, can serve as a tool for the Department management in its daily operations, long-term strategic planning, and overall risk management. However, our work is effective only if the Department implements timely corrective action to address identified deficiencies or weaknesses. We are aware that the Department is planning to take steps to improve its audit resolution and follow-up processes, as the Deputy Secretary indicated, particularly in response to our recent audit, and we will closely monitor and report on this progress. This concludes my statement, and I am also happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Mr. Bakari.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thanks for holding the hearing today. At the Department of Transportation, we take great pride in being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. We're always looking for ways to improve transparency, cut waste, and increase efficiency. This is a duty that we take seriously, and it's something we focus on every day. I'm pleased to join you today to discuss our efforts to implement recommendations from the Department's Office of the Inspector General. But before I discuss the OIG's recommendations, I'd like to touch on a topic that's on everyone's mind earlier, sequestration. Sequestration went into effect Friday. It's going to have serious impacts on the transportation services that are critical to the traveling public, our cities, and our national economy. Sequestration will cut over $650 million from funds recently provided through the Disaster Relief Appropriations Act of 2013, which is helping us to rebuild critical transit systems as well as roads and bridges in states hardest hit by Hurricane Sandy. The brunt of these cuts will be felt in our work to strengthen our critical transit and rail infrastructure in the face of future natural disasters. Sequestration will also cut over $600 million from the Federal Aviation Administration. And as a result of these cuts, the vast majority of the FAA's nearly 47,000 employees could be furloughed for up to 1 day per pay period until the end of this fiscal year. What does this mean for the traveling public? Safety is our top priority, and we will allow only the amount of air traffic we can safely handle to take off and land, which means travelers should expect delays. Flights to major cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco could experience delays of up to 90 minutes during peak hours because we'll have fewer controllers on staff. Delays in those major airports will ripple across the country. In addition, we've notified communities across America that we're likely to close over 100 air traffic control towers at airports with fewer than 150,000 flight operations per year, and to eliminate midnight shifts in over 60 control towers across the country. These are harmful cuts with real-world consequences that will cost jobs and hurt our economy. It's important to remember that our deficit challenges cannot be addressed by cutting waste and improving efficiency alone. The President has put forward a solution to avoid these cuts, and we need Congress to come together to work on a long-term, balanced solution to our deficit challenges. At DOT, we've worked very hard to implement recommendations from the Office of the Inspector General, and the truth is we've made great progress. DOT has established sound systems for interacting with the Office of the Inspector General, which have enabled us to close 505 audit recommendations during calendar year 2012. Our efforts resulted in over $1 billion in program funds recovered, reprogrammed, offset, or put to a better use. This represents a 19% increase in the number of recommendations closed compared to the previous year, and 58% more than DOT closed in 2009. DOT's success is based on a systematic approach that uses objective metrics for measuring performance and a sustained effort by the Department's top management. We are making significant progress on a range of recommendations, such as the Department's Chief Financial Officer has issued new requirements, conducted training, and put in place the systems to better ensure that unused funds associated with grants are deobligated based on regular and systemic reviews. The Federal Railroad Administration has made significant progress on implementing a national rail plan. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has begun to draft a proposed rule that, if finalized, will further enhance the safety of passenger motor carriers. The notice of proposed rulemaking is scheduled to go out for public comment this spring. And finally, the Federal Aviation Administration has made tremendous progress on moving forward with NextGen, which maximizes the benefits of a GPS-based surveillance and navigation system. NextGen is one of our generation's greatest infrastructure investments, and it's underway right now. As part of our efforts to streamline airways, airplanes approaching the Washington, D.C. area, for example, started using satellite routes in August. On these routes alone, it saves 760,000 gallons of jet fuel per year. These are just a few of the areas where DOT has demonstrated its commitment to good stewardship of taxpayer money and to working effectively with our Office of Inspector General. We will continue to carefully review all of the Inspector General's recommendations, and we will continue to use an innovative and results-oriented system to improve transparency, cut waste, and increase efficiency. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I, too, will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. And in anticipation that there's an A-B relationship in these opening statements, Mr. Scuffle.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to discuss opportunities for maximizing efficiency at the Department of Transportation. Each year, we recommend hundreds of actions aimed at improving DOT programs and operations, and the Department works with us to fully implement them. Currently, more than 500 recommendations remain open. My statement today will focus on 10 that we have determined are of the highest priority and that impact the Department's ability to ensure stewardship of its resources, implement transportation infrastructure programs while protecting its investments, and to enhance aviation and surface safety. DOT's ability to ensure effective stewardship of its resources has been limited by longstanding weaknesses in grants management and IT procurement and security. In November 2011, we recommended that DOT conduct quarterly reviews of inactive grant projects to ensure inactive obligations are liquidated in a timely manner. In response, DOT initiated a 60-day effort to review inactive undelivered orders, which identified $2.1 billion in funds for other DOT programs. We also recommended that DOT issue a policy requiring agencies to perform quarterly reviews and annual certifications of obligation balances. Last week, in response to our recommendation, the Deputy CFO issued a memorandum providing guidance on review of obligations and undelivered orders. Later in the year, we will determine if this guidance helped the Department to correct a persistent systemic problem with unliquidated obligations and to identify opportunities to free up funds for other priorities. Regarding IT procurement and security, we recommended that DOT develop its IT enterprise architecture to realize cost savings, reduce duplication of systems, and strengthen IT security through multi-factor identity authentication for all DOT employees and contractors. DOT plans to develop an overarching enterprise architecture by May 2013 and to implement an authentication mechanism by fiscal year 2016. Half of our highest priority recommendations concern DOT's implementation of critical transportation infrastructure programs and the need to protect significant investments in these programs. To ensure FAA's complex multi-billion-dollar next-gen air traffic control program delivers promised benefits, we recommended that FAA establish an integrated master schedule for implementing new technologies and infrastructure. Without a master schedule, the agency cannot effectively address program risks, make informed cost and schedule trade-offs, or determine what capabilities should be delivered first to provide users with the greatest benefits. FAA is currently working on this master schedule. We also recommended that FAA ensure that cost estimates for realigning and consolidating air traffic control facilities are comprehensive and updated. While FAA concurred with our recommendation, it has scaled back its initial plan and is currently focusing solely on the New York area facility, for which it expects to provide a detailed cost estimate by the end of 2014. To completely implement our recommendation, FAA will need to produce detailed financial information regarding its longer-term plans for facility consolidations in other locations. Our high-priority surface-related recommendations also aim to ensure the Department maximizes its infrastructure investments. First, we recommended that the Federal Highway Administration implement a data-driven, risk-based approach for preparing DOT and State agreements for overseeing $40 billion in highway funds provided annually to States. Second, we recommended that FHWA report regularly on States' efforts to improve the condition of the nation's 140,000 deficient bridges. FHWA has begun to implement these recommendations, and we will continue to monitor its progress. We also recommended that the Federal Railroad Administration complete a national rail plan to provide a framework for integrating passenger and freight rail across the country, and identify specific interstate corridor goals and measures of success. Delays in establishing a plan with clear stakeholder roles and performance measures could result in FRA investing billions of dollars in Federal grant funds without assurance that these efforts support national policy goals or reflect stakeholder commitment. FRA expects to complete the plan by June 2014. Finally, we identified two high-priority open recommendations that support DOT's #1 priority, safety. While the Department's commitment to safety is clear, DOT needs to bolster its oversight by fine-tuning how it collects, verifies, and uses safety data. For FAA, we recommended that information on pilot domicile and commuting be collected and analyzed to better target solutions to reduce pilot fatigue. While FAA agreed with our recommendation, it has yet to complete a scan of available data and determine whether additional data could offer significant safety benefits. In terms of surface safety, DOT has acted to remove unsafe commercial drivers and carriers from roadways. However, in April 2012, we recommended that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration publish a rule on passenger carrier leasing, with requirements comparable to those for property carriers. FMCSA concurred with our recommendation and plans to issue a proposed rule in 2013. OIG is steadfast in its commitment to ensuring DOT achieves the highest return on the nation's substantial transportation investments. We believe the Department shares this commitment with us, as evidenced by its many actions and cooperation with our office. We will continue to work with you, Mr. Chairman, the Department, and other key stakeholders to protect taxpayer dollars as we assist the Department in providing the American people with safe and modern transportation systems. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to take any questions that you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for a short round of questioning. Mr. Miller, well, maybe Mr. Bakari, I'll go to you first. Isn't it true that the FAA handled 23% more flights a decade ago than they do today, and they did it with less air traffic controllers?
Mr. Chairman, we have a very different air traffic control system now than
well, one of the deals around here is you answer the question I ask, then you give your ups and adds. So please, isn't it true?
The volume of movements is less than the pre-9/11 numbers. That is correct.
Okay, because one of the reasons we're here today, you've all, on both sides of the aisle, talked about sequestration. So I'm going to focus my short 5 minutes on that question. If you have less flights and more air traffic controllers, very succinctly, what is your justification with all of the so-called improvements, including, and I'm a pilot of more than 30 years, including using GPS, which is, by the way, as old almost as I am as a pilot, and finally getting implemented. What is your justification for not gaining efficiency in the use of air traffic controllers? Air traffic controllers work very hard under great stress. That's been true since I first got my license. But the truth is, navigation aids and a lot of other things, in fact, genuinely justify that the numbers should be less if these efficiencies, which we're paying dearly for, are implemented.
In short, Mr. Chairman, the system that we operate today, primarily because commercial airline operations are very different than they were even 10 years ago, is significantly different. The hub-and-spoke operations are concentrated in fewer places, much higher volumes. The congestion that we have in our major hub-and-spoke operations is higher than it has been in the past. And on the general aviation side, while general aviation continues to do well, the patterns are different as well. I would say the fundamental difference—
Even though, and my time is short and I want to get to all the witnesses, you know, look, I'm a private pilot. There are less of us today than there were a decade ago. The fact is the number of aircraft in use that are actually flying is not going up, it's going down. It's been an industry in challenge for a long time. And I, you know, as somebody who counts on air traffic controllers, but, you know, the implementation of things, including areas that essentially route or forbid private pilots, do not justify that. So the other thing, quite frankly, is I do believe you put air traffic controllers into places in excess of where they were really demanded. So telling me that some small airports are going to lose air traffic controllers as a general aviation person begs the real question of, yeah, isn't it in some cases about time? Mr. Miller, we sent letters to everyone, including your boss, asking specifically for areas that, this was on February 28th, where you would like to make changes, reprogram essentially, drop programs. So in your testimony when you said that, you know, you were going to be forced to do programs, you weren't going to be able to do it, do you know if Secretary Duncan has in fact prepared a response? Because I made it clear that I would sponsor legislation immediately on a case-by-case basis to give him that specific changes, deletes, and so on. He wouldn't have to wait for the CR. And I, by the way, also sent one to Mr. LaHood.
So we'll be preparing kind of the formal response to the mechanism. I think our challenge is this, and the Secretary and I have spoken about this directly. The bulk of our programs go to poor kids, students with disabilities, students in Indian country on reservations, students on military or close to military bases. And the real question is, which of those students aren't you going to serve? Our choices of are not, it's a Sophie's choice.
Okay.
So it makes the idea that you trade off of.
But for 18 months since the President signed sequestration, there was an agreement in sequestration, not for a tax increase, but for a cut. There was an agreement in the tax increase in January that we were having a tax increase. Nobody said, oh, by the way, sequestration is going to be another tax increase. So one of the challenges we face here is 18 months after the President signed sequestration, and I'm not one of those people that wants to figure out chicken or egg on who came up with it. That's for Mr. Woodward and others. The fact is the President signed it. He signed it on your behalf. Your boss agreed to these cuts. And it's surprising to me that I'm still being told that nobody knows where the cuts are. Briefly, Mr. Bakari, I would ask in Hurricane Sandy relief, which you mentioned prominently, do you believe that out of that $50 billion, when you need to make these draconian cuts, that perhaps the pay raises for FBI that were included in there of $10 million could be stripped out? The $2 billion for road projects not anywhere in the affected area of Hurricane Sandy could be stripped out? Or the $500 million for weather forecasting to create ocean zoning plan, at least for now, could be stripped out of this emergency and have no direct effect on Hurricane Sandy victims?
I would first comment on the road part of it. What Congress was doing with that appropriation is actually paying for some of the past disasters where the emergency relief funding for the Federal Highway Administration had not been previously appropriated. Those went to previous emergency relief activities. We are proud of and believe that we are wisely spending every penny of the Hurricane Sandy Relief Fund that's been appropriated to us.
And I will give the same amount of time to the ranking member. I will tell you that when I drove over the Nevada line up to Lake Tahoe just a few weeks ago, I saw a brand new sign that gave credit being put in to the stimulus, in other words, to the Recovery Act. It was being put up 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago when we were driving through in the snow. It's amazing to me that with that money still being spent, at least according to the sign, and the dollars being spent, that every time there is a request for a cut, there's no money and it's overdue. This is one of the challenges we face is if you don't do the $67 billion or some portion of it that we believe can be cut out of waste recognized by the IGs, and every program you have is essential, then you're telling us that only tax increases of nearly double on the American people will in fact solve our deficit. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scoville, you heard the response of Mr. Picari with regard to the Chairman's question with regard to airports and air traffic controllers. Do you, I mean, are you aware of all this, what he just said, that there's a different situation than what it was 10 years ago? I mean, do you agree with the answer, or do you have enough information to answer what I just asked you?
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. I can't agree with parts of it. It is a different air traffic control situation that we have today than it was 10 or more years ago, but it is also a fact that the number of operations has decreased markedly from what it was 10 or more years ago. Mr. Cummings, we have a project underway in my office at the request of Congress to examine air traffic controller productivity. And I think that's what the Chairman's ultimate question goes to. That project is underway. I don't want to prejudge the results, but of course we will be reporting to House T&I and also to this committee when the review is done.
Now, so you think that, do you agree with the Chairman that, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, I'm just trying to remember what he said, that maybe the distribution of air traffic controllers is not the most efficient and effective way to use them?
That is a possibility. We have examined FAA's air traffic controller workforce for a long time, and we have offered in the past recommendations to the agency for how it could analyze the composition and also the distribution of its controller workforce, because we have found problems in that area in the past.
And Mr. Miller, can you please tell us the total amount of cuts the Department of Education is now facing as a result of sequestration?
Well, the impact of our programs, it's about $2.5 billion.
And I understand that about $722 million is in cuts to Title I?
Yes, and about $600 million in special ed programs.
And you said it's a Sophie's choice when you're answering a question. I guess this is what I'm getting to. You hear two sides of these questions, and this is where I'm trying to go to, Mr. Scoville. There seems to be, some people have the opinion that when these cuts are made, the cuts are made to things that they don't have to be made to. In other words, that you have some fat somewhere else that you could cut and not affect, say, programs for kids like me when I was growing up in special ed. So I'm just wondering, tell me about that. Explain that to me. Is this something mandated or what?
Yeah, so the reality is our programs are focused on those who are most needy.
Yeah.
And that is the bulk of our program funding. And in an environment where we have fallen behind the world, 16th in the world in terms of college graduates.
Marching towards a third world nation.
We are 25th and 17th in terms of math and science preparation of our 15-year-olds. And when you look at the direct investment in education and how that impacts GDP, how it impacts employment, how it impacts earnings, and the research is pretty compelling that the quality of education, it's clear that investing in education is critical. So,
but this is my
choice
question.
is the trade-off. We have no choice.
My question is, again, I'm going back. Is there some way that when you have sequestration, under the circumstances we have them right now, that you could avoid the cuts in these areas? And Ms. Tai, you can chime in if you want. I just want to know, is there, because the implication is that maybe the administration is trying to just zero in on things that are going to be most, get the headlines or whatever, and I'm just trying to figure out how strict this situation is.
Simply put, it would be that's where the money is. The money is in these programs. If we were to, there are no alternatives.
Ms. Tai, do you have a comment on that? Am I pronouncing your name wrong? Right? I'm sorry.
No, that's correct.
Okay, fine.
Yes, sir. It's a tie.
Okay.
Well, I would agree that sequestration in its across-the-board approach to cutting is going to leave, many things unfunded, even things that you don't want. And since Title I and special ed and those monies are the bulk of the Department's monies, yes, that's where you're going to see the cuts. I think a better approach would be looking at other ways of reducing funding. I mean, part of this hearing was looking at the recommendations we make. The Deputy Secretary brought up the issue of there are programs, there are 200 programs in the Department of Education. Not all of them are big money programs, but why shouldn't we look at a little more thoroughly and holistically at what programs might duplicate each other? Let's get to the point where we have a duplication within the Department and between the Department and other departments that focus on education things. Why can't we look at that as a government and make cuts there?
Mm-hmm. And so, in other words, go through those programs, the ones that are not getting the most bang for the buck, either reduce or eliminate those to free up money for the others. Is that right? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes.
So there is some leeway then, if these recommendations were, with this sequestration that we're going through right now, there is some leeway if we were to do these things.
Oh, I don't think there's leeway with sequestration.
No, I'm talking about this one right now, what we're going through right now.
Yes, right now I don't think there's leeway. I mean, we're all facing, including my office, across-the-board cuts.
How many? What kind of cuts are you facing?
I am facing, I believe it was the $3 million in my somewhat small appropriation. I am going to be furloughing all of my employees for about 10 to 11 days, including from myself on down, if the sequestration continues through the end of the fiscal year. We've cut out our IT support contract for IT security, our FSMA work. And we're going to cut the support we give for our risk modeling work. And we've told 4 interim employees they need to leave at the end of the month, and cuts like that. So we greatly reduced travel, which is really very much impacting. When you're a criminal investigator and auditor, you have to travel to do your business. Mm-hmm. So I'm having to make choices in what cases we open and what audits we do.
I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. McHenry.
I thank the Chairman. I yield to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for this hearing. Mr. Miller, so I just want to be clear with the Chairman's earlier questioning. You have not responded to the Chairman's letter sent last week?
I believe the letter was received on the 28th. I got notice of it upon my return on Monday. So no, those wheels are turning, but I don't believe a formal response has been submitted.
Do you know when? Tell me when sequestration passed. When that became the law. Do you know when that was?
Friday.
No. When the legislation passed requiring sequestration to take effect. You know when that was?
I don't remember the exact.
August 2nd, 2011, 19 months ago. Have you been doing any planning? I mean, it seems to me when you get a letter from the Chairman about sequestration, you've had 19 months to start planning and getting ready for it. In fact, you should have been ready for it. If you took some time, you should have been ready for it in December, because it was supposed to hit January 1st and was suspended for 2 months. It seemed to me you would have a response ready to go just like that, and you could get right back to the Chairman. So you guys didn't start planning for this until the last couple of weeks?
We plan on the implementation of sequester. That's been quite consuming, actually.
Well, how long have you been planning for it?
We've been planning on the implementation of sequester in varying degrees since beginning of the year.
Why not before that? I mean, it passed August 2nd, 2011.
because both, at least as I interpreted the press like you, it was both parties and the administration, both members of Congress, thought that it would not be going into effect.
Let me go to the statement that the Secretary made, the now famous statement. It just means a lot more children will not get the kinds of services and opportunities they need, and as many as 40,000 teachers could lose their jobs. There are literally teachers now who are getting pink slips, who are getting notices they can't come back this fall. Do you know where the Secretary got that information, what he was basing, when he made that statement, what information he was basing that statement on?
Oh, yes. So the issue of the 40,000, which is a recognition that the bulk of funding goes to personnel costs, and the 40,000 does represent an estimate of, if that was translated directly with the current funding splits.
What I'm asking is, did you guys do some study? Had you guys given him information saying this is going to happen? We have surveyed schools across the country, surveyed some of those military schools, some of the schools on Indian reservations you referenced in your did you survey those, or did you just sort of make this up?
No, we'd be precluded from, that would be inconsistent with.
So how did you base that? How could he make that statement?
Again, we have an understanding of the cost structures from our historic work at the state and at the district and at the school level. We understand the basis of the cost structure. And so when the question is asked, how might this translate into the impact, we can say, if consistent with the current allocation of funds as it is today, this is what it would translate into personnel costs.
You said how this might turn. This was a guess that the Department made and portrayed to the American people as fact.
No, I thought we've been very clear about might, and that if translated, this is the impact it could have. And I think that remains true today, and I think there are examples both in anticipation of sequestration
this doesn't say might. This says,
going forward that this is the impact.
This doesn't say might. This says there are literally teachers now who are getting pink slips, who are getting notice they can't come back this fall. Is that true?
I believe the Secretary has already said he spoke inaccurately and tried to correct that statement. But what is true is the potential impact of up to potentially 40,000 jobs is translated with the current spending pattern.
Is there anything in writing that was given to the Secretary before he made this statement? Anything in writing say, you can say this, we think this is going to happen? Anything in writing, or did this just conversation that took place at the Department?
I can't speak specifically to what briefing materials the Secretary.
Was the Washington Post accurate when they gave 4 out of 4 Pinocchios to the Secretary's statement? Were they accurate, or do you think they're wrong?
I would presume that the Washington Post did what they thought was consistent with their reporting practices. I also know that in a follow-up story today, they've also said that there is an impact of sequestration likely on jobs. So I would believe both accounts from
Mr. Porcari, Mr. LaHood said flights to major cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and others could experience delays of up to 90 minutes during peak hours because we have fewer controllers on staff. Now, Mr. Meadows tells me last week in Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that the FAA administrator admitted under questioning that the 90-minute delays in major cities was not based on any data or study. Is that true? Do you have any, same question to Mr. Miller, do you have any study, any data that says we know for sure this is going to happen? Because I flew this week and it didn't happen to me.
We know some of the specific impacts. Chicago would be a good example. By having less controllers on duty, Chicago has 2 towers. We would not be able to man the North Tower, which means 1 runway would be out of operation, which means significantly lower throughput.
The question is there any study that indicates this, in fact, is going to be the case? And if so, was the FAA administrator misleading the Transportation Infrastructure Committee last week when he said there is no data or study that indicates this is going to be the case?
Both the administrator and the Secretary were pointing out that it is difficult to measure precisely until the cuts are in effect. We know it will have a significant impact, and the primary impact will be on our busiest.
So once again, it was a guess. We have 2 secretaries, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Transportation, guessing, suggesting without data or any study to support that these facts were going to happen. And we have the Washington Post calling the Secretary of Education, I won't use the term, but we have the Washington Post saying that he misled the American people to the tune of 4 out of 4 Pinocchios.
We believe those are reasonable estimates based on what we know now. We know the operational impacts will be significant.
When did you guys start planning for the sequestration? Did you start planning like I think a good administrator, a good planner, a good leader would do? Did you start planning in August of 2011 when this bill first passed?
We were well prepared for January 1st.
Did you start planning then?
We started planning in the fall.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, the IG reports that through 2010, 90% of their audits that they issued since 2007 have not been resolved within 6 months. 53 of those audits were overdue by an average of almost 3 years, including question costs of $568 million. So due to the running of the statute of limitations, it appears that costs questioned by the IG in its audits, the Department lost the opportunity to recover $415 million of costs. 2 years later, in January of 2012, 42% of those audits were still unresolved. So my question to you is that acceptable performance by the Department?
I think we are in agreement with the IG that we need to improve our ability to resolve audits in a more timely way, including through the completion of the corrective action plans. It's directly why we've taken a number of steps, most recently with a formulation of a dedicated task force where we've already driven a 30%, actually a 33% reduction in the backlog, and we should take that backlog to zero in the course of this fiscal year.
But you would agree that you've lost the opportunity to recover $415 million in costs?
We wouldn't agree with that specific statement. Broadly, you say the opportunity. When you actually look at the recovery, that becomes the total potential, of which generally, based on finding and then based on what is in the public's interest, the actual amount, even when we do have timely recovery, is typically a fraction of the total potential cost. So I would not want to leave an impression that the $400 million-ish figure was, in fact, the amount of recovery that would have happened. That would be inaccurate.
Inspector Tai, do you have any comments?
I would agree that we probably wouldn't have seen a recovery of $415 million. Part of our point is when you let the statute of limitations run, you have no opportunity to do anything. A lot of that money did involve school districts and other state and local entities who we know aren't richly funded at the moment. And on the other hand, part of the problem is not just the money, it's the fact that when you don't resolve the audit at all, you also lose the opportunity to to work with the states and other jurisdictions to put in internal controls to make sure they're spending that money wisely. And so you really lose a number of opportunities.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, how much money do you spend, what resources are expended in the suspension and debarment process in the Department?
I'm not sure we have, I don't have that specific kind of allocation because, again, that would be an allocation of individuals that are across multiple functions, but we could follow up with to get the specific investment we're making on the suspension and debarment specific process.
So, all right, if you would get that to the committee, that would be helpful. Have any grantees or contractors been suspended or debarred in the past 3 years?
Yeah, we've had 150 debarments through 2010, and I believe that number has increased since.
And for what kinds of offenses?
It's been for a range of offenses. Again, we could give you a breakdown of those in a follow-up.
And have any of these individuals been debarred permanently?
That I can't answer specifically.
Would you provide that as well?
Of course.
Inspector, do you have some comments on that?
Yes, I do. I think the Department has tried to make improvements in how its focus on debarment, especially in the non-procurement area. As far as grantees, usually the grantees themselves are certainly people associated with grants that have been debarred, based often on our criminal investigative work. To say grantees themselves are debarred, I think may be overstating. Usually the Department doesn't debar a whole entity. It will take individuals out of that entity. But I think that the Department still faces challenges in making its suspension and debarment process effective. We did an inspection report on it last year that highlighted some issues.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield to me for just a second?
Will.
Following up on the gentlelady's question, Ms. Tai, the $415 million, would it be fair to say that if you had every one of those in a situation in which you're negotiating with the excess recipient, that the future savings by not having this repeat would certainly be as great as that $415 million? In other words, the behavioral change would be the ultimate goal in addition to any recovery.
Absolutely. I think we have not quantified, the fact that you can save money over the long haul by putting internal controls into place.
Thank you. Ms. Spear, I think you were exactly on the right line. I appreciate your yielding. With that, we go to Mr. Which one of you guys wants? Mr. Jordan, a returning star, is recognized.
I don't know about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porcari, some members of both the House and the Senate have said that Mr. LaHood's dire warnings aren't backed up by financial data, where I was questioning you before. And they suggested that the FAA could instead cut $500 million it spends each year on consultants and $200 million it spends on supplies and travel. Do you think, and I know this is the FAA, but do you think that's something that we can focus on?
We could not achieve the savings that way, and I'll be glad to document why. Let me first point out what the sequester means. Two-thirds, basically, I'm sorry, three-quarters, 74% of our department is exempt from the sequester, which means that the sequestration cuts fall disproportionately on a portion of the department, primarily the Federal Aviation Administration. That 5% cut, because we're partway through a fiscal year, is equivalent of a 9% cut.
But my question is, do you spend $500 million a year on, does the FAA part of your budget spend $500 million a year on consultants and $200 million a year on supplies and travel? Yes or no? No, that's the point.
Those categories do exist. What are in those categories is important.
Let me ask it another way. Ms. Spear and I are working on a piece of legislation. We discovered this 2 weeks ago in this committee, that we all remember the GSA junket to Las Vegas, where they spent $600 per day per attendee, $3,000 per attendee per conference. And if you use that as a benchmark, 183 times various Federal agencies have exceeded that mark in various conferences they have attended. I'm not sure what the number was for transportation. I do remember defense was over 50 times that they had exceeded that benchmark. Do you guys have, in the past years, the Department of Transportation held conferences around the country, and have folks attended?
We have, and we've dramatically scaled that back.
How many?
I'll be happy to get you the exact number.
Do you know if you were above or below the benchmark? You spend more than $600 per day per attendee, more than $3,000 per attendee per conference?
We stay within the per diem requirements.
Well, we'll check. I bet we can get that information.
I'll be happy to get that for you.
If transportation was above or below the benchmark. Mr. Scoble, do you know?
Mr. Jordan, would you yield for just one second?
I'd be happy to yield to the Chairman.
When you said per diem, that's how much the individual gets paid. What the gentleman was asking is about how much was spent. In the GSA scandal, it was not about per diem.
Mr. Chairman, what I'm referring to is also the per diem rate for hotels, where what people are spending on
How many conferences did you send Department of Transportation employees to last year?
I'll be happy to get you that. I will tell you that I have been personally reviewing and approving conferences.
You don't know that information? As much as it's been in the news, with the GSA, with the hearing we had 2 weeks ago, 183 times we've used that number, and you don't know that information?
I'll be happy to get it for you.
You come in front of the committee talking about sequestration, you don't know how many conferences you went to?
Because we've already achieved the savings we think we can achieve on the conference.
Well, maybe we would disagree with that, and we'd like to have that information in front of the committee.
I'll be happy to get it for you. That was
You might think you've achieved it, but maybe the American taxpayer doesn't. That's why we have these hearings.
We're happy to make that public.
That's what it's all about. Mr. Scoble, do you know how many times they went on trips?
I do, sir. Chairman Issa requested that information from the Department. We have not audited it. I want to
but you know the number of trips?
Make that clear to the committee. Most certainly. Fiscal year 2010, total cost $12,833,000. The number of conferences was 49.
49 conferences, $12 million bucks, but we're going to have 90-minute delays because of this sequester, right? We're going to have to furlough FAA agents. That's the kind of stuff that just drives the American taxpayer crazy. And the fact that you know it, you know that information, and the agency head doesn't, is the problem.
If I may, the single largest FAA conference part of it, and that's the largest part of the department, is actually safety training for our air traffic controllers.
I'm not saying some of them aren't important. What I'm saying is it's $12 million bucks and it's 49 times. That's something the American taxpayer wants to know. Let me move quickly if I can. Mr. Miller, do you know how many conferences you sent Department of Education employees to last year?
I'm sorry. It was roughly...
There's no roughly to it. There's a number. How many did you go to?
Yeah, no, we've got a complete breakdown by size of conference.
You know how many? Was it 10? Was it 49? Was it above 49 or below 49? Did you beat the transportation?
Below 49.
Below 49. Well, that's good. Ms. Teague, do you know how many it was?
I'm sorry, I do not, but I can certainly...
You know the cost that they had for travel and conferences?
I know that we reviewed the costs as reported to this committee in earlier submissions and to the Senate, but I don't have that off the top of my head.
Mr. Miller, do you know off the top of your head how much money the Department of Education spent on conferences and travel last year?
In total, I believe it was about $10 million. I know our largest conference, which would be the Federal Student Aid Conference, came in at about less than $200
How many
per
employees
person.
do you have at the Department of Education?
About 4,400.
4,400. How many employees at the Department of Transportation?
Approximately 55,000.
55,000. They spent $12 million. 4,400. You spent $10 million. Maybe you weren't better than me. That's amazing. And here's the point: instead of having the secretaries of these respective Federal agencies out scaring the American people, maybe cut back on the conferences, maybe actually achieve some savings for the taxpayer and do things the way you're supposed to. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Northern Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If the American people want to wonder why it's hard to reach agreement on sequestration, perhaps that last round of questioning clears that up. Mr. Porcari, I wanted to give you an opportunity, without badgering you, to answer the question fully in terms of air traffic controller training, because there seemed to be some confusion between conferences and training. Would you care to explain what you were trying to get at before being interrupted?
Would the gentleman yield for just a second?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to ask the clock be stopped. That's a question fairly that shouldn't come off your time. If you'd finish the answer, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Connolly. What I was referring to with our air traffic controllers is, although some of the activities are technically listed as a conference, there is a safety agenda where they are basically getting updated education on safety activities and other vital parts of their role. We think that's a very important part of what they do. We also think it's management's responsibilities, mine as Chief Operating Officer, to make sure they do that responsibly and they do that as cost effectively as possible. So for the last year and a half, we have been very carefully reviewing conferences, where, when, how many people go, and what the agenda is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that courtesy. Mr. Porcari, if I could follow up on that, what kind of training are we talking about for air traffic controls? I mean, is this just how to party, how to have a good time in Las Vegas? I mean, what kind of training is this?
This is serious safety training. For example, there's a number of new technologies that are deployed. There are we share safety data. There are day-long activities where they're having various safety briefings and updates and participation. What we are trying to build is a safety culture. And if you're familiar with safety management systems, it starts with the people and with a holistic approach to safety. We think the reason we have the safest air traffic control system and safest aviation system in the world is because we have the best trained safety experts, including our air traffic controllers.
And just to make sure we understand what you're talking about, I mean, training isn't for a lifetime. One has to be sort of refreshed with changes in technology, changes in new information, changes in technique. For example, we're getting ready, I hope, despite sequestration, to invest in the new-gen air traffic control system, which will absolutely expand safety over, for example, the Atlantic. But that requires some kind of training and understanding the technology involved. Would that be a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. The technology and the state-of-the-art is evolving very rapidly. There was a previous question about the number of air traffic controllers today as opposed to previous. I mentioned that the concentration of commercial activity is different than it was 10 years ago. The other part of it that's very important is we are bringing our air traffic control community into the design and implementation of our next-gen system. That's a very staff-intensive process, but some of the early stutter steps that we had with, for example, en route automation modernization were because, in my opinion, we developed a system without an integrated project team approach, did not have our controllers part of the process. We are doing that now. It is a very staff-intensive process to do that.
And presumably that serves a public purpose.
It certainly serves a public purpose of safety, which is our #1 priority.
Right. And Mr. Scoville, as IG, I assume you, or no, do you take any issue with what Mr. Porcari has just said?
On the basis of our available data, sir, it appears to be accurate. If I could return to one of your earlier questions, and I do want to make sure that the record of this committee hearing is accurate, because I certainly don't want to be in a position to have misled the committee at all. When I spoke of the Department's earlier conference expenses for fiscal year 2010, I had also hoped to bring to the committee's attention that the Department reported to this committee for fiscal year 2011, having spent $3.4 million on 23 conferences. For fiscal year 2012, $668,000 for 11 conferences.
Okay.
So whatever 2010 certainly appears to be an unusually high number. It's come down since then. As I mentioned before, these are not audited figures, but they had been supplied by the Department to the committee, and
thank
we were
you.
privy to that communication.
I'm sure the committee appreciates that. Mr. Bakari, real quickly before my time runs out, and again, I thank the Chair for his gracious allowing us for you to finish your answer earlier, but you were accused of scaring the public. Will there be furloughs among FAA employees including air traffic controllers, and will that affect flight patterns and delays at airports? Will there be furloughs at TSA employees, and will there be furloughs in CPB, Customs Border Patrol agents, all of which could lead to delays at airports? Yes?
Yes, there will be furloughs among the vast majority of our 47,000 FAA staff, including air traffic controllers. Because we can't impact safety, we have to reduce the volumes that can be, aircraft volumes that can be processed at the most busy times. We know that will have a significant impact on reliability and on-time performance.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for allowing the witness to answer the question.
You're most welcome. We now go to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank you. Talking about the Department of Transportation here, can you help me understand the formula as to how many days they're going to be on furlough? How many furlough days are there going to be, and how did you come up with that number?
First, in terms of number, we are in the process right now of notifying our employees that they will be subject to a maximum of 1 furlough per 2-week pay period through the end of the fiscal year. So, in other words, up to 11. We have arrived at that by first looking at all other available savings, including what we can do with contracts.
So of the $2.7 billion, how many of the savings are you going to have in non-payroll oriented savings? Like where are you going to cut that's not payroll?
We're cutting back in a number of contracts. And again, within the Federal Aviation Administration, one of the largest contracts is the Contract Tower Program.
But looking for a value here, the dollar amount. If you have to save 2.7, how much of that is going to come from payroll? How much of that is going to come from other savings?
With the Federal Aviation Administration number, which overall the total sequestration number is just over $600 million, we are going to have information technology savings from for FY 2013 of about $36 million. We have a 30% reduction in travel costs. We're literally looking at every single contract for the Federal Aviation Administration, because again, this is where the bulk of the
and I appreciate that you said you started this in the fall, so here we are into March. So given that whatever 4-6 months, how much is going to come out of payroll?
We believe that about I'm sorry. I will get to that number, because it's a moving target, because as we get further in the fiscal year, we originally thought there would be far more than 11 furloughs, and we think so 11 is the outer number.
We don't know the dollar amount. We're talking about maximum maybe 11 days for somebody over the course of a year. How did you come up with 90-minute delays? Where did that number come from?
The delay number comes from what we think can happen. Think of a bad weather day in New York or San Francisco or Chicago, and those types of delays that you typically get from weather activity, we think that you will see because of the furlough activity. I use the example of Chicago O'Hare, where the airfield requires 2 towers. With one of them out of operation because of furloughs, we would actually have to take one of the runways out of operation. That's how we tried to measure the impact. The other thing I would mention is that the number of impacted hub cities we think can be fairly significant. And when any of those hubs are impacted, it ripples throughout the entire system.
The challenge that I have is when we say significant or big, it doesn't sound like much of a plan and some specificity. You're talking about $600 million. What I would love to know is the breakdown between the payroll costs versus the others. You talk about 1 day furlough, right, for every two weeks of work. Is that for the 47,000 employees at the FAA?
Yes, it's for the 47,000 employees that will be subject to it.
So how many of those 47,000 employees are actually going to be furloughed?
The vast majority of the 47,000 employees, the employees that work for some of the mandatory contract spending areas like the Airport Improvement Program are not subject to it. Okay. Everything but AIP within the FAA is subject to furlough.
Mr. Chairman, what I would hope that you could give me, Mr. Porcari, is how long would it take you to give me some specificity on the questions we just answered? I appreciate you're coming and testifying, and you got lots of things you got to prepare for. But if you have a plan, we would like to see it. And what I need to have some specificity on those things I just went through. Is that fair enough? Could you give that to me by what's a fair amount of time?
Well, we have some preliminary numbers now. Again, we know that they will keep shifting, and I'll be happy to provide those by close of business today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yield back.
If the gentleman just, when you include in that, would you also include, to the extent that you can for both Cabinet positions, any steps that could have or were anticipated being taken from the beginning of the fiscal year? Because for scoring purposes, if you, for example, restrained hiring, you could have abated some of this starting sooner. And I'd just like to know to the extent that that was planned or done, because I know it's a moving number, and part of the moving number is things that were not spent that had been anticipated to be spent.
We'll be happy to do that. We have been in a hiring freeze at the FAA for some time, as well as travel restrictions.
Right, and I'd like to make sure all of that, including that which may have reduced the number, is in the record.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add to that list two quick things. The amount of bonuses that were given out this year, and the number two is how much money you spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, because there are 17 different agencies that are still spending money in Afghanistan and Iraq. If there are any dollars associated with that, I'd appreciate if you get back to us on that as well.
We'll be happy to get you those numbers. We have not awarded bonuses this year.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Porcari, do you have data on how many aircraft land at O'Hare that are controlled by the North Air Traffic Control Tower every year?
Yes, we do, ma'am.
And so you could tell me, if that was shut down, how many aircraft would not be landing on that closed runway based on past landings at the airport?
Yes, we can.
Can you tell me how many aircraft takeoffs and landings and air traffic is controlled by the remaining tower at O'Hare every year?
We can get that as well.
Wonderful. So can you also tell me how much more capacity there is on that remaining tower should the North Tower be shut down that could be absorbed by the single remaining air traffic control tower as it stands?
We'll be happy to, and again, the same principles apply at numerous other airports as well.
Wonderful. So then you would also be able to tell me, based on the capacity historic data on how many land at that north runway, if it shuts down, you know how many can get picked up by the other control tower, how many would not be able to be handled in a timely basis, correct?
Yes, we do. And what you're pointing out, I think, is very important, because part of the estimating process for delays goes to historical patterns, whether it's for weather or any other throughput delays.
Wonderful. Thank you. So as someone who's flown most of my adult life as both a professional pilot, I thank you for the training that I, as a DoD pilot, received from the FAA at the safety conferences that I attended. It made me a far better and safer DoD pilot. And now that I am a general aviation pilot, I thank you for keeping me safe. And in fact, I am going to be signing up for one of those training conferences on how better to speak with air traffic controllers in a busy air traffic control environment. So I look forward to attending that training in Chicago that is coming up. My question really is going to be towards Mr. Miller. 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with the superintendents of schools in my district who have been planning on what would happen if the funding were cut for Title I as well as for special education funding. And they know exactly how many people they were going to have to lay off, what it was going to cost them. Mr. Miller, do you know how much money this country spends on subsidies to the oil and gas industry every year?
No, I'm not familiar with that amount.
It's $4 billion. Can you tell me what the cutting Title I education funding will cut from the Department of Education?
$750 million.
$750 million. And how about the cutting in special education funding?
That would be another $600 million.
Another $600 million. So instead of slashing education funding, Democrats offered a balanced alternative that would have made sensible cuts in our nation's spending to subsidize the oil and gas industries that have had record profits. But Republican House leaders have refused to allow a vote. If we could just cut spending on oil and gas subsidies, we would save $4 billion. I'm concerned, Mr. Miller, that my superintendents of schools in my district told me that because there is the requirement that they provide services for students with special needs and also for special education funding, what would happen actually when that Title I funding is cut and when that special education funding, such as for remedial reading tutors, is cut, they would still need to provide that, which means that they would actually cut services to the mainstream students. Can you speak a little bit about what this would do in school districts to have to shift the pressure from students with special needs to mainstream students, and what this would do across the nation if these cuts were to go through?
Well, there's a requirement in serving the needs of students with special needs is that they need to provide a free and appropriate education. And so there's a minimum standard that's required. And as the Federal resources are compromised, then they need to ensure that they still are delivering against that standard, and that puts a strain on resources. It's also at a time when many districts like yours are investing in not just the basic services for those children, but they're investing in new instructional technologies that are going to be more effective at accelerating learning. They're having to deal with the expansions of students who don't speak English as their native language, as they're putting in new data systems, as they're preparing for higher standards that are internationally benchmarks. And so it is not only the loss of resource, but frankly, the leadership that is being spent to do the budget manipulations is taking precious time to also plan from these other kind of meaningful reforms. So really, it's not just a cost impact, but it's really compromising the ability to improve our education system.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. So could you tell me if you will be keeping data on what the sequestration cuts will do to educational programs across the country? I know some of this is based on historic trends, and there has been discussion here of the lack of data. Will you be keeping data over the course of sequestration on what it does to funding education and also to what actually gets implemented across the nation?
We'll continue to capture the data that is currently allowable. Of course, there are restrictions in terms of the types of data that we can capture, subject to our statutory authorities and regulatory authorities. Consistent with that, we'll be able to capture data so that we can continue to understand the adverse impact that sequestration is having.
Thank you so much, Mr. Miller. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here. I know you're taking some heat today, probably because of lack of some leadership at the top and some inaccurate, incomplete statements that have been made. But Mr. Miller, let me ask you a question. A statement was made earlier by one of our committee members that we are dangerously close to being third world country status educationally. I'm not sure of the accuracy of that, but improper payments in the Department of Education, Pell Grant program specifically, that exceeded the OMB threshold of $750 million per year seem to be a problem. In fact, in 2010, improper payments exceeded $1 billion. Mr. Miller, I'd ask you, what steps has the Department taken to reduce the amount of improper Pell Grant payments?
We've taken a number of steps. First of all, what I'd like to highlight is that the rate of improper payments has dropped kind of significantly over the last
well, I'm glad for the rate, but it's still improper payments taking place. And so I guess I'm asking, what are you doing to stop it? What steps have been taken?
Yeah, and I think it's important because, again, the rate, and I'm going to answer the question, the rate's important because it speaks to the impact that the steps we're taking are having. Because, again, as the number of Pell Grants has grown dramatically, the actual percentage that are subject to improper payment has been decreasing. We take a number of steps to work specifically with our financial aid officers in each of our schools to work to better ensure that we have the right students taking out the right amount of loans, again, subject to the statutory constraints that we have. We're working with our IG to better understand where there is potential risk of inappropriate actors, right, and so are not meeting our eligibility requirements. We, specifically on the front end with our FAFSA, which is the vehicle by which students apply for and qualify for aid, we work with the IRS to put in income verification to minimize the risk that inappropriate aid would be granted.
Why are so few using the IRS tool?
I would not characterize that so few are using the IRS tool. It's not as much as we would like, and so that's one of the things we're trying to continue to promote.
Go on.
So those are the types of actions that we're taking to reduce the rate of improper payments.
Any additional actions you're contemplating taking?
Ongoing.
The rate may be going down, but we've gone up in dollars. Most recent dollars that we went up was over $1 billion.
In total, again, and that's a net. And so we're as concerned because part of this is both overpayments and underpayments. And so we're continuing to address both of it. We're concerned about borrowers to the degree that that's a concern, and we're trying to impact where it allows us to better recover funds for the Federal government.
Okay, Inspector Teague, let me address the same concern there. As you explained in your statement, some of these payments occur when applicants fraudulently report false income information to receive grants. Is the fraudulent reporting of false income information the main cause for the improper payments, or has your office identified any other reasons?
Oh, I think that's one reason, but by no means the only reason, which is why I think that the Department's actions and the income match are going to inevitably be limited in helping improper payments. The problem is, just let me speak a minute about the IRS DRT, which Deputy Secretary Miller talked about. Is the problem there is we don't think anyone who wants to defraud the government is going to pick the IRS, data retrieval system. And so what is the Department doing to manage those students, or those applicants, shall we say, some of whom might not really be students, and who aren't otherwise chosen for verification by schools of their information, their application information? What is the Department doing to fix that problem?
What are they doing? What have you found?
Well, we haven't found that they are doing anything. I would also like to highlight that we do have a problem with how the error rate is being calculated to begin with. We do recognize it has gone down, and I think it shows that there has been some modest success in the IRS, DRT match. But I think that the way the error rate is calculated is really just based on a statistical study with the IRS based on income. There's also fraud related to number of dependents and a number of other issues like that can happen.
When we talk about the other issues related to $750 million that could go toward special needs programs, $650 million, when we have $750 million and now over $1 billion of fraud, wasted revenue going to education, I think we've got a problem.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walberg. I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, I would like to emphasize how much I value the work of our Inspector General community. your work is critical for everybody who, like me, wants our government to work and work better and be more efficient. So I thank you for your work in addition to being here today. Now, Mr. Scoville and Ms. Teig, I want to invite you to answer these questions. The sequester's arbitrary, across-the-board cuts, they also do apply to the offices of the Inspectors General. Am I correct in that?
That is correct, sir.
All right. And so the question is, how are your offices impacted when your budgets are cut?
Sir, if I may, we've heard from the other witnesses about how sequestration is impacting their offices. And it is a fact that sequestration will impact our office. My fear all along has been that because, for instance, as Mr. Porcari spoke of the FAA as being a personnel-heavy and therefore a salaries and expense-heavy account subject to sequestration, my office, too, is very personnel-heavy. 75% of my overall budget goes to personnel salaries and expenses. So if we were going to get hit, that was where it was going to happen. And for me, if I'm to accomplish my mission, I have to have my staff on deck. So my focus from very early on was to minimize the impact on my staff, keep them at work. Sure, they may be happy because they're getting a paycheck, but I'm happy because I'm getting mission. And what we've been doing since actually late 2011 has been to focus on eliminating, reducing all expenses not staff-related, minimize those to the greatest extent possible, and then to see how we could write out sequestration. In interest of full disclosure, my office is the recipient of some degree of extra funding in connection with our oversight responsibilities for the Recovery Act and also for Hurricane Sandy relief, so that has provided us some flexibilities. But we could not get to the position where we are today, which is that we will not need to furlough any of our staff were it not for the cost reduction measures that we've had in place for a long time. We've had a hiring freeze in place since August 2011. We've reduced staff. We've released rented space. We have not paid any bonuses. We've withdrawn from a student loan repayment program. Across the board, we have sought to cut every single expense we possibly could.
And let me jump in there, Mr. Scoville. According to data provided to this committee, at the end of February 2013, your office had about 10% fewer full-time equivalents than you had in fiscal year 2010. Is that correct?
That is true. We are, in fact, at the lowest strength level in the history of our office since the Inspector General Act was enacted in 1978.
So what impact has that reduction had on your work?
Impact. Data point, whether it's a completely, it's an imperfect measure, and I will acknowledge this. In 2004, each OIG FTE was responsible for covering $137 million in DOT budgetary resources. In 2012, each OIG FTE is now responsible for covering $192 million of Department budgetary resources. Sir, we have had an example last year where in our criminal investigation side, I regret to say it, we had to take a pass on information that was provided to us to see whether we believed we needed to dedicate an investigatory resource, a staff person, to participate with other agencies in investigating that offense. We didn't have the personnel, and we decided that the expenses associated with participating in that investigation would be too great to justify it. We have also taken steps internally to increase the degree of scrutiny that we will need to apply to every single request, whether it's from the Department or from Congress, for audit support.
I want to jump in there, and I want to give Ms. Teig a chance here. Ms. Teig, your staff also expressed concern about reductions in FTE levels in your office, and with respect to audits, what impact does this have on your ability to conduct audits and investigations?
Well, it certainly will have an impact. As I mentioned earlier, like Mr. Scoville's office, 70% of our budget is salaries and benefits. The next highest increments of funding are the common support we pay to the Department for IT and other costs that I can't control. Then we have our financial statement contract. After that, I get, travel, training, and smaller contracts. We are canceling or will cancel those contracts which support our FSMA work and our data risk modeling. We will be furloughing our employees from me on down for about 11 days, 10 to 11 days through the end of this fiscal year. That will have a very real impact on our work, our audit and investigative work. We're already turning down cases. We're shifting priorities. We're telling our criminal investigators in the field that they can only open the highest priority things, and they better, watch what they do. Our audit work, we had put on our audit plan for this year, for example, a project to look at the grantees for the Race to the Top monies, which is one of the big dollar marquee initiatives of this administration. I don't know if we're going to have the travel money to go out to those grantees.
Thank you, Ms. Teig. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Next is the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. We've had a lot of discussion today about sequester, and we've talked about where we need to cut spending and how difficult this is going to be, and it's been kind of contentious, and even maybe, it seems like people have gotten a little defensive. Let me ask the panel, do you agree, just looking at the big picture, looking at our government and our budget and our deficit, do you believe that we have a spending and a deficit problem in this country? Mr. Miller, we'll start with you.
Based on my reading of the press, I believe that there's a consensus that we need to both address the deficit to preserve the long-term health of the country.
Okay, so we did that with sequester. We cut $85 billion, and then we also had a tax increase, right, that raised about $60 billion in taxes. So we've kind of taken a balanced approach. So, I mean, is that kind of in line with what you think we need to be doing right now based on this $17 trillion in debt?
Well, I mean, to be clear, my area of focus is the Department of Education.
I'm asking you as a
I wouldn't want to
taxpayer.
hazard kind of what I think is the right fiscal policy.
right.
What I would say is the administration's view is that we need a balanced approach. And
Well,
I
I'm
would
just
support
asking
that
you all as
view.
taxpayers, because our committee is here to make sure we're spending taxpayers' money properly. So, Ms. Tai?
As a citizen and a taxpayer, and not as an IG, I would say that certainly a balanced approach makes sense. I do think, I can't help but think, sitting as an IG, that there's government spending that there ought to be spending that can be cut, programs that can be run more wisely. I know that the entitlement programs are a pot of money that ought to be looked at in some fashion. I say that as a, few years off myself from, receiving some of those. And taxes, and I am no expert on tax policy, but nothing should be off the table in my opinion.
So we've already raised taxes. Do you want to pay more taxes?
My husband doesn't,
Okay.
but I feel sometimes it's the price I paid for a better society.
Yes or no? You think we have a debt and spending problem?
As a citizen and a taxpayer, I think the balanced approach is the right way to go.
Okay. Mr. Scobel?
I want to stay in my lane and leave the policy decisions for
Okay.
all of you
All
and
right.
the administration.
Well, I just say that because, again, it's easier to cut other people's spending than your own. You're all here. You're passionate about your departments and so on and so forth. In education, I guess I'm disappointed to hear, Mr. Miller, you come out saying we're taking a hatchet to education. And do you truly believe there's no waste in education? I mean, we've had the Department of Education now for 3 decades, $1 trillion put in there. Math, science, and reading scores are essentially flat. There's Pell Grants that have gone from $12 billion to $43 billion over the last 4 years. We're not really seeing a return on that investment. I mean, we've had, as I think Representative Jordan said, we've had 19 months to prepare for this. Is there nothing in the Department of Education that you could look at that you would want to cut first before you start saying, we're going to take a hatchet to Head Start, to special education programs? I mean, that sounds to me like scare tactics. That sounds like something I've been hearing from the White House. Is there not a better approach in prioritizing spending cuts?
I would say I think we have. I think what you've seen is our proposals with the support of Congress to eliminate 49 programs that cut $1.2 billion out of our programmatic budget has in fact been very consistent with trying to make some smart trade-offs.
Okay,
I
and
think
all
we're at a
that's
point
left then
now
is to
where
come here and say we're going to cut
Title
these
I,
programs.
yes, in an environment where we're actually raising the standards because not enough states have competitive standards, where we're actually putting more of a challenge on our educators to do more, better, faster.
Okay,
We think to disinvest in education at this time is only going to threaten the long-term growth and health of this country.
Yeah, and we all know that sequestration, we talked about, the Republicans taking these draconian cuts. You realize Super Committee had equal number of Democrats and Republicans at the table. So sequestration was a failure by both sides of the aisle to come to an agreement. So we have to make cuts. We better get used to them because there's going to be more coming. This is just 1/10 of our deficit spending. So I would suggest that maybe this is a good learning experience today, that we're going to see more cuts, and maybe we need to prepare as we move on. You were talking, Mr. Porcari, about the 47,000 air traffic controllers. And we're going to have to furlough them. We're going to have to take maybe up to 11 days out of the year. I know that there's been increases in salaries, 47,000. I don't know what their annual salary is, but could there be a pay cut before we decide, hey, taxpayer, you're going to have delayed flights because we're not going to give up anything. Nobody wants to give up anything. They just want to take more. And I think the problem what we have in this country and in this government right now is excess spending. We all see it. We know that sequestration was a responsible thing to do in the sense that we finally cut spending. But instead of all of us feeling good that we're doing the right thing after admitting we have a spending problem, then we're instead villainizing this. This President should be out saying, thank you, everybody, for making a shared sacrifice. We've taken the first step in doing the right thing. And now, we shouldn't be sitting here whining and complaining about what we have to do, because we got a lot more of it to do. And I know my time has expired.
Mr. Porcari, there's a question there. Do you want to answer it relative to the contracts and so on for air traffic controllers?
Yes. First, I would point out through sequestration, our employees are in fact taking a pay cut of up to 10% for the remainder of this fiscal year. We've worked very hard over the last couple of years to have a good working relationship and an appropriate collective bargaining relationship with our air traffic controllers. We have I think, 180-degree turn in terms of the working relationship that shows up in how we implement things like NextGen with our workforce. I would point out, I think we run the risk of undoing that and unraveling that.
Okay, I will take a liberty for just a second to make sure that I get the answer to that last question. Within the contract structure, you can have a reduction in force, you can have furlough. If I understand correctly, simply reducing the amount of pay per hour is not within the current, even with sequestration, is not contractually allowed. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. We have started, I should point out, over 90 days ago, the collective bargaining process with our air traffic controllers for the furloughs.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we understand what the government can or can't do, which is, we all have suggestions of what we'd like you to be able to do. I only want us to stick to the ones that you could do at this juncture. With that, we go to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this hearing. For the record, let me state to my friend from Tennessee that the American people know exactly what's going on here in this Congress, which is nothing. We shirked our responsibility with the Super Committee. We shirked our responsibility with Simpson-Bowles, and they don't like it. So you can cast blame if you want to, but the American people are smarter than that, and they know that we aren't doing a thing. Let me direct my questions to Mr. Miller and Ms. Tye. In 1994, there were only 7 states with charter school laws, and 60 operational charter schools. Today, there are more than 5,000 charter schools in 40 states and D.C. The rapid growth of charter schools presents an opportunity to help reform our education system by presenting innovative practices that can be incorporated into traditional public schools. But this growth also presents risk and requires rigorous oversight. Deputy Secretary Miller, one of the concerns identified in the Inspector General's letter to the committee involves how effectively the department is overseeing and monitoring charter school grants. There have been numerous reports of fraud in the management of charter schools. Do you agree with Ms. Tye's concern that there needs to be increased accountability for charter school funds once they reach the entity running the charter school?
Simply put, yes. We believe that from a policy standpoint, the growth in charter schools and the potential they offer for being able to develop innovative reforms are good. We think oftentimes you have a proliferation of different oversight and authorization models at the State level that make kind of the subsequent oversight kind of more complicated. Our direct interaction, generally speaking, is with the State entity and with the authorizing entity who are responsible for the fiduciary duty in terms of the oversight of funds. So our work is with the States versus with the schools. And I think we share concerns that States need to do a better job in terms of exercising that oversight.
Yeah, and then so how does the department create more transparency in how charter schools use taxpayer funds? I mean, do you look at graduation rates, test scores, reading levels, and math tests?
Relative to if they're direct recipients of, let's say, Title I monies, they are subject to all of the statutory requirements of Title I, and there's an accountability system within that. Generally, the dominant framework, however, is the State framework for governing schools, and so, again, we work in partnership but respectfully have to defer in cases to where the State's governance framework with respect to charter schools.
Although we send them Title I money, we have some responsibility with that.
And we do provide oversight for the Title I money.
Okay, Ms. Tai, I'm a strong supporter of high-performing charter schools, but I'm also troubled by the risk of the privatization of public schools under the guise of charter operators. In your investigation involving education charter management organizations, do you find that fraud and other problems are more prevalent with for-profit organizations or nonprofits?
We haven't found a difference between profit and for-profit. We have found problems with charter management organizations. We're actually getting ready to commence audit work in this area also, because while we've had a number of investigations involving these entities and charter schools in particular, we really wanted to go in and get a good look at what that might mean. But I agree with you that there's problems.
And so it could be we may be able to find savings in these funds that go to some of these organizations.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've had a number of investigative cases already, probably since the last few years. We've opened 56 charter school investigations. We've had recoveries of so far of about $10 million. The Deputy Secretary was correct when he said that part of the problem is that there are a number of authorizers in every State, and they vary, and the level of oversight varies wildly among States, and that, I think, lies where some of the problems are.
All right.
I thank the gentleman. A good line of questioning. We now go to Mr. Mica of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Percari, in the recent legislation Congress passed, known as MAP 21, the Transportation Reauthorization, we mandated the consolidation or elimination of some 50 Department of Transportation programs. Can you tell me how many positions have been eliminated and what taxpayer dollars we can expect from that consolidation or elimination of programs?
It's a very good question. First, we're in the process of the consolidation right now, and as you know, there are specific MAP 21 requirements for doing so. We're very far along in that.
Can you give us an estimate? Is it going to be 100 positions, 500 positions, and will it save $1 million, $10 million?
Although the programs have been consolidated, the need for oversight and implementation of the funds has not gone away. We will be redeploying the personnel in what we think is the most effective way.
How many positions do you expect to eliminate?
We're currently, through selective hiring freezes, trying.
So nobody?
I did not say that. I said through selective hiring freezes, we're trying to actually control the headcount.
And the other thing, too, I hear from outside talking to our DOTs, I mean, people are just trying to justify their continued existence, and Congress sent a mandate out to consolidate or eliminate 50 some 50 programs, but people in the Department of Transportation are still making excuses to continue the red tape and paperwork, and I haven't gotten into the devolution on that, which, again, I see the same thing. So maybe you could supply the committee with some information on the savings, the elimination of programs at a time we're trying to save money. Now, I talked about contract towers. Before I became chairman of aviation back in 2001, there was a GAO study. Maybe you remember it, Mr. Scoville, about the operation of contract towers. And it came in and said that they cost less, and also they had better safety operations. Well, after I became chairman, they asked me the air traffic controllers, I said, this is a skewed study. This isn't right. They didn't ask the right questions. I said, well, give me the questions. We'll ask them. So we did another study. The study came back and it said that for every contract tower, we save $1 million, and they operate, and they also carefully monitored the safety record safer. Now, we've been cutting back. You said contract towers is one of our biggest contracts, and we're cutting that back. What's the proposal to cut back?
The proposal is to, first of all, the objective that we have is to.
But we have we're spending $134 million. Is that what we're spending?
We want to minimize the inconvenience for the maximum number of travelers.
But how many are we? How big is the cut here?
So the criteria, there are up to 248 towers.
Yes, 248.
But both FAA operated and contract towers in that universe.
And each contract tower operates. Well, the price that I had is that the savings is about $1.5 million per contract tower, and it's also safer. So you are cutting back substantially contract towers. This is your biggest. You said this is your biggest contract, right?
It is.
So
yes.
wouldn't it make sense?
It is one of our biggest contracts.
That we wouldn't, and we had a list from way back where the Clinton administration recommended another 69 towers to be converted. Bush never converted them. Don't you think we'd start looking at some ways we could save money and make it safer? Mr. Scoville, are you familiar with that report? Am I?
You're generally correct, sir. However,
that's all I need to say. We won't even get into the.
The gentleman will get at least a little bit further than generally correct, if you don't mind.
Well, real quickly, but would you provide the however for the record, because I only have about a minute left. Sure. Mr. Procari, okay. How much in the rail area are we cutting?
I'm sorry?
In the rail area, passenger rail.
On the passenger rail side, there are actually, it's about a $10 million cut. We are cutting back on administrative expenses.
We talked about some things with the conferences, et cetera. Now, we lost, the increases in loss and food service on Amtrak have gone from like about 81 to 85 million in the last fiscal cycle. We could eliminate food service. You think anyone would starve between here and New York? We did a little analysis in the Transportation Committee. Every hamburger was underwritten almost $7. We could stop that loss. Couldn't we? $85 million in loss. Wouldn't that be an area that we could look at instead of some of these other essential safety services? Would you consider that?
And again, the Amtrak cuts are about $70 million. We'll be happy to have that discussion.
But we could do it just by eliminating food service, and the loss would save us $85 million just last year. IT, and let me close with IT. That's Mr. Klinger up there. He's the former chairman. When I came to Congress, it says the Klinger-Cohen Act required, again, that all the agencies come up with the enterprise architecture. We have $3 billion in annual expenditures for IT in your department, and we have 400 information systems, some duplicative, some archaic, some obsolete, and DOT still does not have. And I understand something's coming in May.
Yes.
A plan? Okay, we're waiting with bated breath.
We agree there's significant opportunities for savings there, and that's actually been a subject of management focus.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Okay. And now for the rest of your answer, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Chairman Issa. To just very quickly, Mr. Mica, I couldn't show my face back at my office if I let this go by. You mentioned a GAO study on contract towers. In fact, it was an OIG study. We've done 2 of them. You're right. They are less expensive than FAA-operated towers. They are as safe as FAA towers, and generally accepted with approval by the user community.
I apologize.
Thanks.
I meant IG.
Thanks.
Thought he might. And with that, we go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Tai, your office did a study, and I think over 3 years they found that there was $187 million in Federal student aid funds involved in student fraud rings.
Yes.
So I commend you on that. It's a good study, but in reality it's about less than 1/2 of 1%.
Yes, it is.
Of what we spend on Federal aid, and next to what I find on the subcommittee of oversight for the national security is like minuscule on that basis. But it's important nonetheless. So if you look at for-profit institutions in the higher education field or whatever, I've got some statistics here. 90% of their revenues come from taxpayers.
That's correct.
Right, 90% in the
That's
form
the
of federal financial aid, Pell Grants, student loans, GI Bill funds, Department of Defense tuition assistance. They have about 10% of all student enrollment, but they take up about 25% of all financial aid dollars that we spend. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, Pensions reported for 2009-2010 they got $32 billion of taxpayer money on that. That's a lot. We've had some problems with overpricing tuition and predatory recruiting practice, things of that nature. But I want to do this. Have you looked at them with respect to whether or not they're at greater risk for these fraud rings than some of the other institutions?
Where we have seen the greater risk is the low-cost institutions, which is primarily community colleges. Now, there are for-profit schools, for example, University of Phoenix, that operates a community college component called Axia College, which is a little bit lower cost, has seen a number of problems with fraud rings. It's the lower cost institutions primarily, although not exclusively.
Can you explain why that is? I mean, my thing is
Absolutely.
you've got so many more dollars in these programs going to one set of institutions and less going to the other. So what's the distinction?
It's not really a
invites them
function
in?
of dollars. I agree with you on your statistics, but the problem with fraud rings is it's all about what comes back to the so-called student. So when you sign up online, you have invisibility to your institution. So they sign up for classes, they apply for student aid, they then, the community college, say for example, will take back from the Title IV funding, say that you receive a Pell Grant of $5,000 because I am going to put zero income on my application. Well, what happens is the community college will take its, say, $600 for a semester of classes, and it will remit the rest to you for room and board and books and other expenses related to education. The problem we see for distance education is, why are we funding room and board in those kind of circumstances? All of that grew up when, brick and mortar schools, where you go on campus, you live there, and you need to pay room and board. You do not necessarily need to do that in distance education. There is a restriction on the old correspondence schools. Remember those. You do not get room and board for correspondence schools. The post-9/11 GI Bill done by the Department of Defense eliminated significantly living expenses. So that gives you money that goes back to the bad guys. So all they need to do is get a bunch of their friends or inmates in prison institutions to apply for student aid, and then they kick back some of that money to the ringleaders.
So, Mr. Miller, that raises a good question. What are we doing about that?
I mean, generally on the issue of kind of how do we address these fraud rings, what we're finding is, again, in large agreement, working with the IG and following up on the recommendations to take actions. You'll see they break down in a series of, there's some system changes we can make.
Like what?
Like there's statistical models that on the front end, through the application through the FAFSA, of which, again, it's not a few, it's about 60% of eligible recipients go through the FAFSA. You can put flags in where if there's a pattern that we think looks like suspicious behavior, you can basically require more personal identification to go on the application process, would be an example. Some of these, however, require statutory changes. So there's things that require statutory changes that if you're really going to change some of the eligibility requirements, that requires actually Congress to act.
Are you making those recommendations to Congress?
I mean, that's something we'll work with Congress and pursue what we think is kind of the right approach. And in the middle, there's regulatory changes that we're also making to address this. We go into negotiated rulemaking, and again, it's a very public regulatory process.
So could you provide to this committee the recommendations that you've made for statutory changes and the recommendations that you're making for rule changes?
Yes, there will be a process by which, for negotiated rulemaking, we're starting with hearings. The process that goes out to hearings and to inform it.
Can you provide for us what it is you're doing? Just give us an update on exactly what requests you're making for rule changes and what you recommend to Congress be changed in the statute.
Of course. I just wanted to be clear, though. Part of the hearings in the regulatory process is to not, in fact, we have to honor the process which says we cannot have a prescribed prescription even before we start the negotiated rulemaking process. It is meant to be informed by the public. And so at the time that then the agenda gets set, we would obviously share that with happy to share that.
So you already have some idea of what you think ought to be changed in the law, so you can give me that part at least, right?
We have an understanding of the issue, and then the question is how do we engage on what the appropriate.
So you've come to no conclusion yet as to what changes in law may be required to be useful?
No, that would be premature at this point. We understand there's a problem. We understand there's different ways to address the problem, and coming up with a specific kind of statutory or legislative solution, we are not at that point.
Ms. Tai, can you help us?
Well, I think the primary statutory change we recommended was the change to the cost of attendance. I think there has been some modest movement in the Senate through the appropriations bill for this year that would look at Pell Grants, but I would urge Congress to look at it as a total package of not just Pell, but also the loans that one can get. It possibly just looking at Pell could lead to a somewhat perverse situation where a financial aid administrator would do two calculations for cost of attendance, one for Pell and one for loans, and a student who is disadvantaged or otherwise might get more of a Pell might end up borrowing more. So we want to avoid that. But I don't know that the Department has put in concrete fashion any kind of proposal to change the cost of attendance.
Okay.
Mr. Tierney, if you'll summarize.
Thank you. Do you have any written report with respect to this, Ms. Tai, that you want to draw our attention to?
Well, we did do a written report on the fraud rings that I talked about, and we do make that recommendation.
You do make the recommendation?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
I'd like to thank the gentleman. I might remind all of us that the ranking member and I, in the last Congress, sponsored the DATA Act, which passed, that would have changed recipient reporting, would have changed a lot of the databases on which these kinds of investigations go. I'm not sure that you can use, but Mr. Miller, the Recovery Act, the so-called RAT Board, has been extended by this committee's pushing and acting, and I might suggest that some of what you are trying to find, you may still be able to use that asset that former IG Devaney set up to do some modeling of what could be done on a broader basis, and we certainly would encourage that, and if you need support from us, we would provide it. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you, Chairman Issa. Back when I was in high school, I was a DJ, and about the time I would get sick of a song is about the time people would start to know what the song is and start to like it. I'm kind of getting that same feeling with a lot of this talk about sequestration. A lot of the American people who are busy raising their families and working are really catching on. And to me, I think they're seeing that this is looking a whole lot like a manufactured crisis with people screaming that the sky is falling. If I were out, if my personal budget were being sequestered and I were in your place testifying before this committee, I might choose not to pay my mortgage and say, oh my God, because of sequestration, my children are going to be homeless. Or I could choose not to eat out as often and say, oh, my children are going to go, my family is going to go hungry. Heaven forbid we go look for a box of noodles in the pantry, macaroni and cheese. Actually, our kids would probably prefer macaroni and cheese to some of the places I take them. But here's what I'm getting at with that. I really do feel like this is a lot of posturing. And I want to ask the two secretaries here, if I were to come to you and say, cut 2% from your budget, do whatever you need to do to cut 2%, minimize the effects, 2 or 3%, minimize the effect on safety, minimize laying employees off, you've got carte blanche to fix your budget to cut 3%. Could you do it? And we'll start with Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I think, candidly, we struggle with that. It gets back to the same. The money is in, money for poor kids, money for students with disabilities, money for kids on Indian reservations, money with kids.
Right, but
so, like,
there's
which child is more or less important, or what
but there's
services
not
are more or less
3% in
important?
overhead. There's not 3% in waste, fraud, and abuse. There's not 3% in something maybe we don't need to do.
99% of our budget is in program dollars. It's in direct program dollars. It's not.
And there isn't
overhead.
waste, fraud, and abuse in any of those programs, despite these fraud rings we're hearing about.
What I would submit.
Yeah, so you're telling me you couldn't cut 3% from the budget if I asked you to?
I say if we are having the sequester is forcing us to cut. If you said, could you find cuts that would not adversely impact education and students who are struggling right now, or at the least advantage, and who are struggling to participate in our global economy because they don't have the skills? I would say no. I would say making those kind of cuts is going to have an adverse impact that we will regret.
All right. I just can't believe there's not 3% there. What about in transportation, Mr. Picari?
Thanks for asking. Again, what the sequester is in a part of a fiscal year, because 3/4 of our department is exempt from it, is the equivalent.
All right. So if I
of a 9%
unexempted everybody and
cut.
gave you carte blanche, could you do it?
Of course we can do it. It's a question of what the impacts are, and that's the process we're going through right now. I'd point out the easy stuff has been done. Since 2008, for example, within the Federal Aviation Administration, we've cut $510 million out of the cost basis by reducing travel by 30%, IT savings $36 million, $100 million from innovative contracting.
I think Mr. Micah came up with a nice laundry list of things we could still continue to look at. And I find it very difficult. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. So I just find it very difficult to believe that when, just with the increased cost of gasoline, many families have had to squeeze 3% out of their budget now. And I just don't think it's unreasonable that we'd be asking. And, you know, we in the House have come up with 2 different replacements for sequester that aren't as painful. And I get at least you could find something, Mr. Miller, maybe not. I do want to go on to the Inspector Generals because I have an important question for them, because I'm subcommittee chairman on this committee of the Post Office Government Workforce and the Census. And recent news reports in the Washington Post suggest that agency managers could be able to choose favorites among their employees to spare them from furloughs and sequestration. And let's ask Mr. Scoville and Ms. Ty, can you commit to us that the IG's office will be looking to make sure that whatever furloughs come are handled in a fair and appropriate manner, and we don't have political reprisals or choosing of favorites?
We'll investigate every allegation, and we have a hotline center that's equipped to take those allegations and to ensure that they are inquired into properly.
Ms. Ty, is that a similar situation in education?
Yes.
All right, great. And then I've only got 25 seconds, and I had a couple of questions on improper payments, so I'm just going to yield back the remainder of my time.
If I could have that time.
It's all yours, Mr. Chairman.
If you, Mr. Picari, and you, Mr. Miller, if you went to your workforce and told them that they had a hypothetical choice of taking that furlough, that 5% effective pay cut, or finding a way to come back to you and show that they could do the same amount of work with 5% less employees next year, not this year, but in the next fiscal year, would you predict that your workers would come up with organizational changes, your middle managers with organizational changes that would allow you to keep the let me rephrase that, keep the pay and benefits where they are and do more or do as much with slightly less people? Just a prediction, and I think that's what Mr. Farenthold was really getting to, is isn't there enough organizational lethargia that builds in that, in fact, almost any workforce faced with reducing by attrition and other means or taking a pay cut, they'll find a way to do better in efficiency?
Most of the savings since 2008 that I was just outlining have actually been suggested to us by our employees. We have a smart, very committed cadre of public servants. They will continue to find savings, and I would submit, Mr. Chairman, they would do that with or without a sequester scenario.
Mr. Miller, you would also agree that your workforce is smart and innovative and, given the right motivation, can help us in this process?
And I would argue that they have been, like what Mr. Picari has stated. I think, frankly, we have asked them, even today, to take on more and more responsibilities that they are forced and have been over the last several years to be more innovative with their programs. We're asking them to take more accountability for closing out audits. We're asking them to take more responsibility for providing real effective assistance to our grantees, not just about getting the money out, but making sure it's having an impact. So we're asking more and more of our employees each and every day. And so to say, yet again, can you do more, I think our employees would welcome it, but they would not see that as a new request.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Nevada for his patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, prior to coming to Congress, I served in the State Senate in Nevada, and over the last few years, we experienced